In this molecule, we're going to talk about organic macromolecules. Macro means big, big organic molecules. So when we start, we need to first talk about monomers and polymers. So mono means one, poly means many, mer just means unit. So we're talking about one unit that we then combined into polymers. So monomers are used to build polymers. So a simple building block again and again and again, like a bunch of bricks, makes a polymer, like the brick wall, for example. So in order to do that, there's a pretty simple reaction that occurs. If you're taking smaller monomers and building them together, in order to covalently bond each monomer to the other monomers, you need to remove something so that you can covalently bond each of those monomers, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to remove a hydrogen from one of the monomers and a hydroxyl group from the other. And when we do that, we're going to create water. Okay, and when we create water, that's called condensation, just like water is created on your, the side of your mirror in the bathroom when you're in the shower. So condensation just means forming water. Some books, in some places, they'll call it dehydration synthesis. Well, dehydration means removing or pulling water out. So again, it's really the same thing. If you hear condensation, forming water, or dehydration, pulling water out, what you're essentially doing is you're removing a hydrogen and a hydroxyl group in order to covalently bond monomers into a larger polymer. So synthesizing proteins or synthesizing big carbohydrates from smaller sugars. These are examples of condensation or dehydration reactions. Occasionally you have to do the opposite. So when you eat meal, you eat proteins and complex carbohydrates and starches, you have to break them up. You have to digest them into smaller units. So in order to do that, we need to actually, if we're going to split a polymer into many monomers, we've got to have something we can stick onto each of the ends of those smaller monomers. So we need to take our water molecule and essentially chop it. And the term for chopping water is hydrolysis. Hydro, water, lysis means to split up or to lyse. So when we do that, we take water, split it with an enzyme, stick a hydrogen on one and a hydroxyl group on the other, and we've now broken a polymer into smaller monomers. So as you eat starch and you eat proteins, your digestive system chops up these polymers into monomers through this process called hydrolysis. So let's look at the first main organic macromolecule, and those are the carbohydrates. So we have simple carbohydrates, which are called sugars, and we have complex carbohydrates, and we'll talk about what they are as well. But the term for simple sugar, again, one is mono. Mono means one. Saccharide is, I think, the Greek term for sugar. Greek or Latin, I forget. But the monosaccharide, simple sugar, is one sugar molecule, sugar monomer, and the formula for that is C6H12O6. So in carbohydrates, we always see this ratio of 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. So as we build up, for example, a disaccharide, we'd see C12H22O11, same ratio, 2 to 1 of hydrogen to oxygen. So, two examples of monosaccharides are right here. Here's glucose, that's found in blood sugar. We've already looked at that a couple times. Here's galactose. This is the monosaccharide that makes up lactose, which is a disaccharide. A glucose attached to a galactose makes a lactose. So these two look very similar. They both have the same chemical formula, C6H12O6. But if you look very carefully, there's one difference on there. So if you just kind of look and kind of figure out, oh, there it is. So notice the hydroxyl group here is kind of oriented to the back relative to the other parts of the molecule, whereas this hydroxyl group is coming up. There's sort of shadows there to show what's forward and what's back. So just that simple arrangement, that one change makes these two slightly different in terms of their structure. They have the same chemical formula, but a different structure. And the term we use for those types of molecules are isomers. And this is important because some people are lactose intolerant. They can't break down the galactose-glucose bond the way they can break down a glucose-glucose or a glucose-fructose bond because of the structural differences. The enzymes just can't get in there and break it apart. So isomers can sometimes produce important differences in these carbohydrates. So here's glucose. This is kind of the main monosaccharide. It's your blood sugar. It's when you eat starch. Starch is basically a glucose polymer. Glycogen is glucose polymer. And cellulose, they're all glucose polymers. They're made up of this one molecule, again, repeating units of it over and over and over again. So if we look at connecting two monosaccharides to form a disaccharide, so I have a glucose and a glucose, they form a maltose, or a glucose and a fructose forms a sucrose, that's just table sugar. Remember what this reaction is called? We take two monomers, pull off on water, and connect them to make a disaccharide or a polymer. That's called a condensation or dehydration reaction, right? We're removing water to covalently bond two monomers to make a polymer, okay? So again, in this case, if we're performing a disaccharide, that just means two sugars together. Anything more than two, we're just going to call polysaccharide. Two or more, or I'm sorry, three or more connected, we'll just say polysaccharide, okay? So two important polysaccharides that we are going to look at and that you have to know about are the ones found in plants, like this one, which is found in the chloroplast, or the photosynthetic unit of a plant, and then the ones found in animals. So think about freshman bio, think about when you eat plant material, where do you get most of those complex carbohydrates, right? Well, we tend to call them not amylose or amylopectin, those are fancy names, right? Let's just call them starch, right? So starch is the polysaccharide produced by plants, and it's how we get most of our complex carbohydrates in our meal. So when you're eating bread, when you're eating rice, potatoes, those are all starch-based polysaccharides made by plants. When you eat them, you digest them and break them up into glucose, and your blood sugar goes up, and then your body produces insulin, and insulin sends a signal to your liver and to your muscle cells to kind of process out that excess glucose. So your blood sugars are maintained at a relatively sort of narrow level, what we call homeostasis. So the process of converting that back into a polysaccharide, you don't make starch. When you eat animal tissue, muscles, it doesn't taste starchy, but what they do produce is they produce a polysaccharide called glycogen. Now, glycogen is not a word you're probably that familiar with. Maybe you remember it from freshman bio, but glycogen is, again, a water soluble. It likes water. It's going to stick to water. It's going to be a very heavy, very dense molecule. So what our bodies will do is very quickly convert excess glycogen into fat for long-term storage. So when you go on a diet and you lose a couple pounds really quickly, you're quickly just processing out all that excess glycogen, and it sticks to water. You end up peeing out a lot of that excess water that's bound to that glycogen. So in the first couple of days of a diet, when you lose weight, you're like, oh, it's the water weight. Well, you're actually getting rid of the water that's bound into that glycogen. And then when you start to burn fat, it takes a lot longer and it's a lot harder on your body. But glycogen and starch, the two important energy polysaccharides for plants and animals. So one note, we talked about isomers, different arrangements. So we actually have two isomers of glucose, and this is important. Notice alpha glucose, we've got the hydroxyl group over here on the number one carbon in this lower position, and then over here we have the hydroxyl group above the carbon. So just flipped around, even though they're basically almost identical structure, that one small difference makes alpha glucose versus beta glucose, okay? And this is important because if we connect a bunch of beta glucoses together, we have these beta bonds. If we connect alpha glucoses, we get alpha bonds. So let's look at why that's important. So here's a polymer, starch, made up of these alpha bonds, okay? And these alpha bonds form something like that. If we look at cellulose, that's the last important polysaccharide, glucose-based polysaccharide we'll look at. It's got the beta bonds. So notice the arrangement here is one oxygen up, one down, one up, one down. So what that means structurally when you look at cellulose is it forms these very linear chains. Remember when we looked at starch and glycogen, they were very sort of curved and branching, and they form these sort of irregular shapes. It turns out our enzymes need that irregularity to kind of bind on and rip apart those glucoses so we can break them down. Because of this kind of linear and then these cross-linked, these hydrogen bonds that are formed between these polysaccharide chains, we don't have any enzymes that can break these bonds down. So though most plant biomass is this molecule cellulose, we can't break it down. It's indigestible. It's what we call fiber or roughage in our diet. So salad, greens, and most leafy greens that you eat, you can't get any energy, even though you're eating pure cellulose in there. It's only eating starch or other polysaccharides that we can get energy. The last polysaccharide, this one's Similar. Notice this looks a lot like glucose, but it's got this weird nitrogen group on it. And it forms a polymer called chitin. So chitin is sort of this weird little kind of other polysaccharide. It's found in fungal cell walls. When you eat mushrooms, you're eating this polysaccharide called chitin. It's also found in insects in their exoskeleton. It makes them kind of gives them a little bit of strength and flexibility. And so chitin is another polysaccharide that you'll occasionally run across, and it's basically a glucose polymer with this nitrogen group attached to it and forms polymers just like starch, cellulose, and glycogen. So this is just an overview of the forms of carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. In our next video, we'll talk about lipids.